So yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Adam, and the name of our panel is Psychedelic Rabbit Holes on Conspirituality and Other Sense-Making Traps on the Post-Truth Era. This is a mouthful with all sorts of different concepts and words that I'm not assuming that everybody knows or is familiar with. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to present the people that are participating in this panel, and then I'm very briefly going to unpack a little bit what actually is this conversation about, and then each of us three is going to have a brief presentation that we're going to touch briefly on the things that we're particularly interested in these themes, and then we can have a conversation, including input from all of you guys here in the audience. So yeah, first me. Hey, my name is Adam, and I am a doctoral candidate in medical anthropology and cultural psychiatry. For the last 4.5 years, I've been living in the Amazon rainforest, mostly doing fieldwork. I have been living and studying and doing fieldwork in a center that specializes in providing ayahuasca workshops and retreats. We're working with Shipibo people, and other than facilitating workshops in the self, I've also been doing a couple of different big research projects, mostly qualitative research, one in collaboration with ICERS and the Beckley Foundation, and another one with Imperial College, basically looking at all sorts of different parameters of why people find ayahuasca and the whole setup of a workshop to be beneficial and healing. That's in a nutshell. And yeah, I'm gonna be touching on a few of those aspects later on. Moving on to my friend and colleague, Olivia, Dr. Olivia Marcus. She earned her PhD in medical anthropology through studying mestizo shamanic plant medicine and perceptions of mental health in the Peruvian Amazon. Olivia completed a master in public health at Columbia University with a focus in socio-medical sciences, health promotion, and disease prevention. Before beginning her doctoral research, she worked at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and at the International Center for HIV/AIDS Prevention on projects concerning the prevention of HIV/AIDS in New York and Sub-Saharan Africa, respectively. Since 2015, she has conducted research in the Upper Peruvian Amazon, where she investigates local methods of healing, international networks of practitioners and clients, and the increasing syncretic forms of therapeutic practices, namely the combination of local shamanic healing with Western psychotherapy and psychiatric practice. Olivia is interested in sensory experiences with healing, ethical issues in intercultural medicine, and decolonial struggles for land sovereignty. Ali, how are you doing? Alexander Beiner, the co-founder of Rebel Wisdom and one of the directors of Breaking Convention, Europe's largest conference in psychedelic medicine and culture. Ali has been involved in psychedelic activism for the last 15 years and is particularly interested in bringing critical lens to the way psychedelics are entering mainstream culture and medicine. He recently produced a short documentary called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism to explore this topic, featuring interviews with leading voices in the field. As a holistic counselor and facilitator, he's also interested in how psychedelics can intersect with other practices to create safer, more integral approaches for personal growth and healing. Cool. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do want to ask maybe from all the people in the audience, as you can already notice, English is not my first language at all. Sometimes it may happen that some people have trouble understanding what I'm trying to say. This usually happens for either one of those two different reasons. Either one, I'm speaking very, very fast, or two, I'm not opening my mouth wide enough, okay? So if any of these two things happen, I just start going blah, 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 please very kindly and politely just write in the chat, we don't know what the fuck you're saying, and then I'll just take a minute to breathe and continue with our conversation. Yay, I see lots of people are joining us already and already interacting in the chat. Cool, so yeah, I mean, we're gonna present a little bit and then you guys can all chip in and we're gonna also interact with some answers and comments. So yeah, I mean, the topic of our conversation, thank you. The topic of our conversation, again, like psychedelic rabbit holes, conspirituality, and other sense-making traps of the post-truth era. This is something that maybe hasn't really been talked about that much in these spaces, and nonetheless, we feel that it's very important, at least to present some of the main concepts, open up a conversation, bring our input based on our personal experience in these spaces. The main subject really that we're dealing with here is epistemology. Okay? The epistemology, one of the branches of classical philosophy, which basically is the study of the nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. Okay? What do we know? How do we know what we know? How do we know that we know what we know? We know, and all sorts of different variations of these tongue twisters related to knowledge. But more specifically, not only about epistemology, but how the psychedelic experience interact, okay, with this realm of knowledge. And specifically, as the title suggests, epistemic traps. Okay, so an epistemic trap, the way that I define it, at least a sense-making trap, is when our theory of knowledge, okay, that process for understanding the world around us, understanding the experiences that we're having, becomes short-circuited, okay, or becomes hijacked. And this can happen for all sorts of different reasons. Okay, our sense-making process can become short-circuited because of infectious memes, because of bad logic, bad actors. Okay, bad actors can be either naive actors or misguided actors or malicious actors who are trying to influence the narrative in some way. Disinformation, misinformation, a whole range of cognitive biases that we're not usually aware. They're influencing the way that we process information. Prejudice, trauma, social and cultural perceptions, political agendas. Okay, there's many factors really that can influence how we perceive, process, digest information, and then translate that into knowledge. Example, okay, something that I'm very aware of from my work. One of the biggest cliches in New Age spirituality. I mean, again, like New Age, we're using this term very broadly. This is not as straightforward as it may seem. But one of the cliches that we oftentimes hear in medicine spaces is like, this resonates with me, hence it must be true. Okay? This resonates with me, hence it must be true. The New Age movement, it draws a lot of influence from Romanticism. Okay? The Romantic movement that was born in a way as a reaction to the Enlightenment period, okay? All the values from the Enlightenment, rationality, logic, Romanticism pretty much said, well, yeah, that's cool, but also we kind of like want to prioritize feeling, want to prioritize sensation, we want to prioritize our emotions, right? So it's kind of like a reactionary movement to the perceived disenchantment of the world following the Enlightenment era. And, you know, so one of these classic epistemic traps of modern Western spiritualities is that belief that if something feels true for me, then it also must be true for everybody else. Okay? So my truth is the truth with capital T. My reality tunnel, in a way, is everybody's actual reality. Or on the other side of that coin, that my reality tunnel is just as true and valid as your reality tunnel. Okay? So this sort of like an epistemic relativism, where my truth is just as valid as anybody else's truth, no matter how biased, underinformed, or politically motivated that truth may be. Okay, so we hear that a lot, we hear it all the time. Well, no, this is my truth and that must be respected. Well, yes, okay, but to what extent are we going to engage in that relativism? So yeah, I mean, this kind of thinking oftentimes ignores the fact that humans actually, we are exceedingly easy to manipulate. And it's very easy to conflate my inner truth or some sort of higher guidance or spiritual guidance with something entirely different that can be anxiety, it can be prejudice, it can be a whole range of unconscious and unexamined beliefs about the world, even trauma. Yeah, like trauma can oftentimes feel very strongly as inner guidance. So, I mean, does this mean that feeling and intuition are not valid ways to gain knowledge of the world? No, okay, these things are important, but it does take a lot of epistemic humility to be able to say, well, this feels right to me, while at the same time staying curious and open about our degrees of certainty about whether that's actually true or not. Okay, and one of the guidelines that I oftentimes like to propose to the people that I'm working with during a workshop is, well, if we're starting to feel too certain of something, that's probably an important red flag to look at, as opposed to something we proclaim as an ultimate truth. Okay, so there's important concepts here that I'm sure both Ali and Olivia are going to touch on afterwards, which are nuance, complexity, okay, the ability to reside in paradox, okay, letting go of the need to be in control, feeling comfortable in the midst of a chaotic universe. Okay, all of these are very important qualities for psychedelic explorers that can get lost if we don't really embody that epistemic humility and make sure that we are maintaining a sort of epistemic hygiene. Okay, so these are two concepts that I like to propose: epistemic hygiene and epistemic humility, which I think by this point are self-explanatory. So yeah, I mean, this panel is limited in scope. Okay, we can touch on all or even most of its possible different epistemic traps, but we do want to perhaps focus on the ones that each of us, coming from our particular interests, feel that are more relevant. Another big word that you can see on the title of our talk, conspirituality. Okay? I'm sure many of you have already been acquainted with this word, conspirituality. I mean, it's a word that kind of has become quite well known as of late. A lot of people have been working on it, writing papers, this whole podcast devoted to conspirituality. Basically, conspirituality is this intersection between Western, New Age, modern spiritualities and conspiracy fantasy or conspiracy theory. It isn't actually a new word. It's a word that has been around for quite a while. It was first coined by a researcher. Her name is Charlotte Ward, more than a decade ago, again, to describe that very pervasive intersection between spirituality and conspiracy. Okay? The interesting aspect of conspirituality, the one that is the most relevant here, is that this is actually written by Charlotte Ward, and she says the two core convictions of this broad political spiritual philosophy. The first one is traditional to conspiracy theory. The second one is rooted in the New Age. Okay, so these are like the two main beliefs, the two core convictions, the two things that kind of like permeate this line of thought amongst our communities. Okay? The first one is a secret group covertly controls or is trying to control the political and social order. Okay? That's more from the conspiracy side of it, and then more from the spiritual side of it, which is humanity is undergoing a paradigm shift in consciousness. Okay? So we are all collectively going paradigm shift in consciousness. We are ascending to a new dimension in awareness, and hence the best strategy for dealing with the threat of a totalitarian new world order is to act in accordance with an awakened new paradigm worldview. Okay, I'm sure that these things are familiar to everybody here. Okay, we all heard these things in different iterations of it: the ascension of consciousness, a new paradigm in human thought, and of course the idea that there's a cabal of people controlling and dictating the order of the world. So yeah, conversations around conspirituality have become very prominent as of late, okay, gaining enormous momentum in the past year as some world events have come into the mainstream spotlight. Okay? I'm sure some of you already know what we're actually referring to, okay? Phenomena such as QAnon, okay? A fascinating and ultimately quite destructive manipulation of populist sentiments that, coupled with that exploitation of people's spiritual fantasies of awakening and ascension, the imminent quantum leap in consciousness, okay? The iconic Q shaman, which we've all seen in the internet, conquering the US Capitol in Washington, D.C., in the front pages of every newspaper around the world, the poster child of the conspirituality movement. And another event which has shed much light on the conspiritual undercurrents in our communities, okay, is of course COVID-19. And particularly this very strong wave of COVID denialism that is emanating from this intersection of New Age, wellness, yoga, plant medicine, through the agency mainly of a handful of quite influential alternative health, anti-vaxxer influencers. Okay? There's actually a report put forward by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which points singles out like the 12 main people that are disseminating disinformation in relation to COVID-19. And I mean, to be sure, yeah, like the current pandemic, it is a very complex affair. It's something that is very, very difficult to make sense of. And it is precisely because of that erosion of trust in public institutions, because we don't really trust governments very much. We don't really trust public health officials very much, academics, experts, pharmaceutical companies. So this lack of trust, or this loss of trust, that definitely exacerbates this loop of misinformation that becomes particularly dangerous in the midst of a global emergency. And of course, a lot of that lack of trust is pretty warranted. I mean, big pharma does have a pretty awful record when it comes to transparency. Pharmaceutical companies do have a pretty awful record when it comes to the prioritization of the well-being of the people it profits from. And this adds to that sense-making complexity to which many people in the conspiritual world usually appeal to. The fact that many of our institutions are, in fact, corrupt, and the fact that many conspiracies that were dismissed in the past as figments of people's vivid and deluded imagination turned out to be, well, too real. Yeah. But I guess this is just all to say that we're not necessarily positioning ourselves. So I mean, I'm probably just, at least speaking for myself here, I'm not positioning myself in some sort of epistemic pedestal as if I know what's going on and I know what's going on with the world, but rather, just in a sense, as a goal, okay? I mean, we all to some extent end up believing like a whole range of fucked up things one time or another time. And even though we do all have our personal views in regard to all different subjects, rather what we want to do, or what I want to do, is to open up a more productive conversation for better individual and collective sense-making in our communities, better epistemic hygiene, and more epistemic humility in medicine spaces. So I'm gonna close just like this segment just with that one concept, okay, epistemic hygiene, right, which refers to the extent that we are able, and this is particularly as facilitators, as medicine providers, as people who work in these spaces in either capacity, as healers, okay, even as researchers, and so on and so forth, to be able to live like our beliefs and our ideology outside of the ceremonial space, as to not pollute the participants' experience with whatever we might take to be the absolute truth, particularly when it comes to like this highly flammable, divisive, or deluded politicized agenda, like QAnon on one hand, or other religious and pseudo-religious projects of redemption and awakening on the other hand. Total epistemic neutrality is practically impossible. Okay, we believe that everything is discourse, the medium is the message, so on and so forth, and yet we can mitigate their impact in somebody else's inner landscape by embodying just a better epistemic humility and being self-reflective about our own infinite biases, assumptions, beliefs, motivations, and so on and so forth. So again, it comes back to that capacity to be comfortable in the midst of chaos, okay? To be able to be comfortable in the midst of paradox, okay? And really just being self-reflective about what is it that we're putting forward. So Ali, can you jump in?
Sure. That was great, Adam. Would you like me to talk for a specific amount of time? We're going to do a format where we each lay it out and then have an open conversation. Is that correct? Yeah. Great. So, yeah, I think a useful place to start is actually defining what sense making is, because it's kind of a fancy word for something that we're doing constantly. And sense making is a little bit different to kind of just understanding what's going on. Sense making is an ongoing kind of almost moment by moment process of figuring out what's going on and then acting on it, and then reevaluating and then acting on that again. And right now, it's incredibly difficult to do that as a human being, because we have an information landscape which is insanely complex, way more than our ancestors would have had to deal with. This is a topic we've covered a lot on Rebel Wisdom, and a lot of people have spoken to really well, people like Daniel Schmachtenberger or Tristan Harris. If anyone saw the social dilemma, we kind of know that where we get our information from is captured by many different forces, ideologically captured, it's captured by the market. So if we want to figure out what the hell is going on, it's not as simple as it used to be, where we were able to, whether it was the right thing to do or not, but certainly it led us to some cohesion, outsource our sense making to trusted institutions. It's actually a really interesting exercise to go through to ask yourself, what institution do I really trust? And I notice when I ask that question that it's really tricky to find one, and they go from global down to local. And for me, the trust becomes more, become more trusting as it becomes a smaller institution. So I think another place to start with from a wider framing is, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter if we can't make sense? And how does that, how do things like conspirituality relate to that? So if we can't make sense of what's going on, we can't take action. And anyone who spent any time on the internet or just being alive, maybe in the last 20 years, will know that we're living in a time where we're living in a postmodern world where we've decided that the grand narratives, the big narratives like religious narratives or political narratives or nationalisms, we're not into those anymore. We've kind of quite rightly realized that it's not a trustworthy thing to put your focus in, and also leads to a lot of its own issues. So that means there's a proliferation of micro narratives. Adam, you kind of spoke to that a little bit about like kind of my truth, your truth. So we have this proliferation of different narratives, but what's happening now with exponentially expanding technology is that all those different narratives that, and it's often happening online, but not only online, are dialed up to 1,000. And so we have this narrative warfare going on. So if we're trying to get information about something, it's incredibly difficult to figure out what to trust or not, because everyone has a narrative agenda in this kind of world. And this speaks to a wider issue of that we've covered a lot as well in Rebel Wisdom of the meaning crisis, which a cognitive psychology professor called John Vervaeke has done an amazing 50-film series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. If anyone wants to check that out, I'd highly recommend. The meaning crisis is our current crisis of not knowing why we are as a culture. So what are we for? What is our culture for? What does it mean to be alive? What's the point of being alive and not killing yourself? What is worth living for beyond just our egos or consuming? And we need something that is a higher order purpose to live for. And so what I mentioned before, we had these grand narratives that allowed us to make meaning and have cohesion. Those are gone. And so, Nietzsche talked about this to some extent with the death of God. There's this absolutely ginormous existential vacuum in the heart of our culture, and arguably in the heart of each of us. And we have to fill it, because if we don't fill it, we don't know why we're existing. And so we fill it in many, many different ways. We all fill it in some different way. We're all trying to fill it. But one of the ways we fill it is by using politics or using a cultural tribe in place of the thing that used to give us meaning. So we basically project all of that deeper, almost, I would say, a religious impulse for connection, meaning to something higher than ourselves, and we project it into a political party, or we project it into a tribe. My friend Peter Limberg has actually argued that it's not just left or right anymore, which I think many of us will be familiar with, and that's something that's fascinating about conspirituality, because it's a full circle where you have the traditionally progressive New Age and the far right coming together in a kind of shared mistrust of authority in general. There's also other, just as a tangent, there's other interesting correlates to that as well, which is the idea of connecting back to the land. I think it's a fascinating area, because hippies, we all want to connect back to the land and have an authentic, deep relationship with our ancestors, or with either our own ancestors or a recognition of ancestral connection. And the far right also wants to connect deeply to the land, to say, this is my land, this is where my ancestors are from, and it's for me. So there's a really strange tension between those two things. So there's a lot of weird similarities between like the New Age and the far right, which are mind-blowing to me. I'm really surprised seeing it, especially in COVID, but we can maybe plant a flag in that. But to return to at least the way I'm currently seeing it, we have this deep, deep void, and we're filling it with our own fixation on our tribal identity. So Peter Limber calls it Memetic Tribe. So it's not just left and right. It's I'm part of the. There's so many different ones, and they're proliferating all the time. You might see yourself as someone who's extremely progressive. You might see yourself as someone who's part of the intellectual dark web. You might see yourself as a classical liberal. You might see yourself, and within those, there's dozens of kind of more granular tribes. And so we have this, like I said before, this narrative warfare between all these tribes. And that is a place where, if we delve into it, trying to figure out what's going on, it is really easy to get caught in misinformation. And a concept I found very, very useful is actually from John Vervaeke, who I just mentioned. He talks a lot and has done a lot of research into salience and relevance. So we know that the psychedelic experience acts on our salience network. So salience is what is standing out to you in your environment, what's calling for your attention. Of course, when we're in the psychedelic experience, lots of things are calling for our attention. Everything is more salient. My feelings are more salient. My thoughts are more salient. That glint of light on the floor is more salient. So we have salience, which we're always kind of negotiating with in life. And then we also have relevance. What is relevant? What is meaningful to me? And one of the insights from Vervaeke is like, what is salient is not always relevant. And that's really, really important, I think, because the internet is like a kind of psychedelic machine in some ways that's pumping out salient stuff, clickbait, stuff to hijack your amygdala, stuff to get you into that tribal mode of fight or flight. The algorithm selects for that. And so we have all this salient stuff, but probably 80, 90%, that's just a guess, is bullshit. It's just bullshit. It's weaponized information that someone either just gets money out of clicks, or someone's own ideological tribe gets some clout for it. And so to be in that world, to be in the world right now is almost like being in a trip all the time, right? To be navigating the information landscape of the internet is like being in a trip in many ways. And so we need to develop the capacities to be able to navigate well. And so you mentioned epistemic humility, which is probably for me also the most important, saying I don't know. And because most of the time we don't know. We're not climate scientists, we're not epidemiologists, like we don't know about so many things. So we have to be comfortable with conditional knowledge. We also have to be comfortable with complexity. And there's a term called complexity tolerance. And there's also from Dan Siegel the idea of the window of tolerance. So where how much general input can you tolerate before you go into a shutdown mode or you go into a fight mode. And so I think the same argument can be made for information complexity. Like when we're just overloaded by too much complexity, we have a very natural human urge to boil it down to something simple. It's all the Bilderbergs, or it's all lizard people, or it's all Bill Gates. This urge to make everything one thing. And that is something that happens not just in conspirituality, it happens in all ideology. And for me, I find a great sadness and honestly a disappointment in how much it's come up in different communities I'm in over COVID, especially the psychedelic community, because Terence McKenna remains my kind of psychedelic hero, probably someone who has had the most impact on my thinking. And McKenna always said, ideology is not your friend. Make up your own mind. And this is a point Daniel Schmachtenberger makes a lot, which I think is a really good one. If your response can be predicted, if I give you a piece of information and I can predict your response to it, then that's simulated thinking. That's not genuine thinking. That's like running a script. And we all run scripts sometimes, for sure. But we have to, or it serves us at least, to find a way to notice, okay, that was a knee-jerk response I just had because I have my own kind of ideological conditioning. How do I take a step back and decenter? So one of the facets of mindfulness, which I think is absolutely a key skill for all of us, to take a step back from the content of your experience and observe it without reacting, to get a bit of space. And then also, yeah, the skill of not reacting and not judging and just observing and being in that space of curiosity. Curiosity is absolutely key, because curiosity also changes our nervous system response. So if you can go from a space of activation into curiosity, then we can mitigate the worst effects of our own biology. And so there are a lot of skills we can learn. I've started calling it psychedelic sense making, actually, when I'm just kind of playing with it still at the moment, but there's various cognitive and mindfulness skills that we can learn that make it easier to navigate and easier to notice when we have fallen into a cognitive trap. So yeah, just gonna check in and see if there's anything else that's worth mentioning before I finish. Yeah, I think overall, it's about, I think one of the key things, if we're talking about conspirituality in particular, is to come back to that sense of meaning. And I think I've been thinking a lot and writing a lot recently about the religious impulse that we have as human beings and our unconscious urges and how those play out. So I mentioned that a little bit before, but there is no point in engaging in, say, the QAnon phenomena, or extreme, extreme leftist versions of reality, where everything is boiled down to everything is about oppression. Some things are about oppression. Not everything can be boiled down to a single frame, ever. I'm very, very adamant about that. I've never seen that be the case, and it's incredibly suspect if I ever hear any ideology saying everything can be explained by this model. Of course it can. We have to be able to hold multiple perspectives at the same time. And again, that comes back to our complexity tolerance. And it also means that we have to be willing to be kicked out of our own tribe, because nuance and holding multiple perspectives doesn't work if your tribe only wants to have one perspective. So there's a courage to it. There's a humility required to it. There's a messiness to it, because also, like, as we're trying to do that and trying to make sense, we're going to mess up as well and get it wrong. We have to be okay with getting it wrong out loud. Right now there's a real sense often that people feel afraid to say anything because they don't want to be attacked by all these different tribes. And so I think that's another thing that's very important, is to be able to think out loud and make mistakes. So yeah, I think that I'll stop there, and very curious to hear from you, Olivia.
Wow, thank you both. That was amazing. And there's so much in the chat and in the Q&A that I think we all want to address. So I'm going to try and keep this to 10 minutes. I'm not going to talk necessarily about epistemology, but more of this wider context of conspiracy, rumor, and gossip. The psychologist Nicholas DeFonso examines conspiracy theories through the lens of rumor psychology, because in trying to understand conspiracy, we typically focus on the individual. For example, why do individuals believe such outlandish, unlikely, paranoid tales? And the line of inquiry tends to examine what individual personality traits or personal characteristics predispose a person to conspiratorial beliefs. For example, we might think of an individual's religiosity, their state of mental health, or educational achievements as individuals' factors that influence the extent to which a person is susceptible to believe in a conspiracy theory. Of course, as the past few years, and particularly the past 12 months, have demonstrated, no one set of society is immune to conspiratorial thinking, and neither is this phenomena neatly divided along political lines. One notorious example that we've already talked about, Adam, and I think Ali mentioned, is the past 4 years actually, I think QAnon erupted in 2017, and the movement's ability to really defy our notions of political, educational, racial, religious, and spiritual boundaries. So I'd like to start with parsing the difference between rumor, gossip, and conspiracy, since these are entangled both behaviorally and semantically, yet differ with respect to scale and perhaps durability. My interest in this topic became kind of more deep and definitely academic during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014-2015, which set off storms of social media-fueled rumors, conspiracy theories, and calls for equity and justice that are always amplified in times of epidemic illness and large-scale disaster, such as devastating weather events, military attacks. And at the time, the rampant conspiracies and rumors that my colleagues and I were studying had to do with the same topics that we are seeing today. Whether or not we can trust the doctors, scientists, and public health professionals, whether the Ebola virus was spread intentionally to kill Black bodies, whether the proposed vaccine was further part of the plan to kill dark-skinned Africans, and whether local remedies such as bitter cola, saltwater baths, spiritual healers, and avoiding bushmeat were more effective in preventing Ebola than what the medical and public health discourses suggested. And since we're living in a time of global infectious disease epidemic, it is of course relevant to bridge these topics, that being the rampant conspiracy theorizing that overlaps with the spiritual and with the uptick in rumors and conspiracy that occur during unstable public health events. So, as I mentioned, I took a deep dive into the rumor response and conspiracy theories during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, when many hunting, culinary, spiritual, and medicinal practices were suddenly altered or amplified in the face of epidemic threat. And in this case, however, the public health officials, doctors, and politicians all characteristically use the concept of culture as a culprit for naive or mistrustful responses to biomedical intervention or kind of mainstream, public health conventional ideas. So at this point, I point this out because I see a parallel when we single out New Age spirituality in the context of what is happening in 2021. Since narrowing our gaze to one specific spiritual or cultural practice, so to speak, New Age being this kind of spiritual or cultural practice, as the ultimate determining factor for why certain people are susceptible to behave or think in a certain way, falls into this age-old trap that anthropologists have been trying to warn people against for decades. So although we're speaking about this neologism, conspirituality, I hesitate to single out New Age as the ultimate driving force of this phenomenon. And of course, the overlap between conspiracy theories and spiritual beliefs is not a new affair. And New Age gets this really bad rap for being a superficial appropriation of different traditions around the world that ultimately manifests as a confused and sometimes dangerously misinformed bricolage of beliefs and practices. Yet it's often no less harmful or misinformed than other spiritual or religious practices. And that might be a scandalous statement in this context, and I won't spend time defending it because there's not much time here, because I want to take attention to something bigger than New Age, something that's older and more universal, and that is a phenomenon of rumor, gossip, and conspiracy theorizing that occurs in every cultural context, regardless of how ancient a culture is, how Western or modern a culture is, regardless of indigeneity or from which diasporas a community might descend from. This is because rumors and conspiracy theories, such as those that have abounded in the wake of HIV epidemics, tuberculosis outbreaks, cholera outbreaks, Ebola outbreaks, and military attacks in different countries, and now during the coronavirus pandemic, are not merely concerned with a mysterious deep state, notorious secret societies like the Illuminati, or a nefarious medical system allied with influential tech billionaires who want to control our minds via hypnosis and chip implants. Believe it or not, these kinds of fears were abundant before the advent of the internet and the widespread knowledge of the microchip. This is because conspiracy theories, as the anthropologists Charles and Clara Mantini Briggs explain, explore the effects of racism, economic exploitation, global capitalism, and international conflict. And it is from these larger issues that constantly press upon local communities that conspiracy theories emerge and are breathed into circulation. Rumors, on the other hand, tend to deal with smaller scale matters. DeFonso defines rumor quite simply as an unproven information claim in circulation that may be true or false. And anyone who has spent a significant amount of time in community with other human beings will acknowledge rumor and gossip to be a fundamental part of human sociality. Conspiracy theories should be thought of in the same way as rumors, an unproven information claim that may be true or false. And DeFonso proposes that we think of conspiracy theories as conspiracy rumors, and that we can apply the general knowledge of rumor psychology to understanding why conspiracy theories develop. And this all generally boils down to what anthropologists say, which is that certain circumstances breed conspiracy rumor activity, and that these conspiracy rumors do specific things in these circumstances. For example, in the face of deadly structural racism, economic exploitation, and a series of massive public health crises, people and communities reach out for improvised explanations, which essentially are rumors, until, of course, proven true or false. However, in our post-truth world that we live in, even this ultimate result of proving something true or false is difficult to render. In addition, these structural and more conceptual level threats that are the psychological threats that we feel when our identity, values, community, party, ideology, or anything else we happen to cherish is criticized or ridiculed. And we're witnessing all these elements converging right now. The global awareness of economic exploitation and political dispossession, exasperation at the persistence of the global racialized hierarchy, and the psychological threats against identity, values, and ideology. And this is where we land at the problems that have arisen with the merging of conspiracy theories with specific spiritual communities that are loosely considered part of the New Age. And yet I found that many of the mainstream conversations about conspirituality are overly psychologized, and not in the sense of looking at the psychological threats that conspiracy theories respond to, but rather considering conspiracy theories as the main issue and the main symptoms of, and quoting Jules Evans, mental illness, trauma, loneliness, bad education, and weak critical thinking skills, toxic cultures in both Christianity and New Age spirituality, social media algorithms, and the breakdown of agreed meanings and truths in Western and global society, end quote. So while this claim is certainly true, it doesn't address this broader global history of mistrust of the government, nor does it acknowledge that we can trace this kind of conspiratorial thinking back to the advent of European modernity, when the relationship between economic precarity and ethno-religious factionalization sparked the racialization and internal colonization that would come to dominate and terrorize much of the planet through the present moment. So while we discuss all the latest social ills and their relation to the mess we find ourselves perpetuating, I urge for thinking from this historical perspective, as well as for striving toward critical media literacy, which is kind of underlying what Ali and Adam have been saying and what I've been seeing in the chat. Rather than submitting to this well-worn scapegoat of late capitalism and globalized neoliberal ideology, which of course may be faulted for many of the great and terrible aspects of our lives, it is important to remember that even in early or middle capitalism, so to speak, or before the world was so intensely globalized, that conspiracy theories always abounded. And I suggest that what we are talking about when we're talking about conspirituality is an aspect of the process of privatization and commercialization, that is the enclosure of what would be called the commons of sacred medicines, medicinal plants, and the human capacity to experience altered states of consciousness. And this process and magical and conspiritual thinking that occurs alongside this process is not new age, but just plain aged at what you could call a cultural artifact several hundred years old that has traveled with us throughout time and space, touching on practically every aspect of society and every society that we can historically account for. So when these conspiracies are part of the mainstream beliefs, we call them a social fact, or maybe even truth at some points in time. Yet at other times, they are relegated to the stalks of conspiracies or theories, perhaps even demoted to smaller scale circulation of rumors. So I'll end by emphasizing that there's nothing inherently inaccurate in psychologizing the New Age and this particular moment of conspirituality, especially since many New Age beliefs and practices incorporate different psychological theories from different eras. And I want to also acknowledge that Jules Evans' ideas about conspirituality are highly nuanced, far beyond the quote that I attributed to him, and that a great start to digging deeper into these issues would be to access the Chakruna hosted conversation between him and Eric Davis, which I think Josh already linked that into the chat. Their conversation and my own assertion here points to that in thinking about the current state of conspiracy theories, rumors, post-truth manifestos, and their imbrication with global spiritual beliefs and practices, we cannot overlook these historical elements within the social trends that help us explain how and why we arrive at this moment. And we cannot forget that many conspiracy theories throughout history and around the globe have been and continue to be related to large-scale medical abuse of Indigenous and Afro-descendant populations. We must also recognize that the history of eugenicist and national projects that define the history of the United States, as well as many other nations and medical and educational institutions throughout the world. But in remembering this history, we can develop a more critical understanding of where rumor and conspiracy come from, in which situations they tend to have more power over the general public, and arriving at the present moment, why the sudden plurality of some patently absurd conspiracies is somehow both normalized and also seemingly novel. So this panel is meant to discuss how we, as people who advocate for the protection of sacred plant medicines and the communities that have been in relation with them for generations, can develop better critical thinking skills on this topic. And I'm really happy to get into this conversation. And I think I'll stop there.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the chat is very lit and there's a lot of people interacting, there's a lot of questions. I mean, if you guys go to the question and answer section, there's an option that you can like somebody else's question. So we can see which are the questions that most of you feel more relevant for us to engage with. I can see already there's one salient question that is probably a good place to start. Before we go to the Q&A, I do want to ask Ali or Olivia whether there's something else that is on your minds in relation to the interaction between all three of us that you would like to add briefly before we jump into Q&A.
I would love to just build on what Olivia was just talking about. I found it really fascinating and grateful that you brought in the historical element of it. I also found the rumor connection really interesting. What struck me when you were talking was that to some degree, the religious impulse in general and many of our key religions are conspiracy theories to some degree. I say that kind of flippantly, but Buddhism, it's like, it looks like there's stuff, but really it's nothingness. Like, this is nothingness is something, so you have this kind of perceptual urge, or Gnosticism kind of also looks at the world around us and questions whether it's some kind of cognitive fantasy that we're stuck in and need to break free from. Get this in lots of different wisdom traditions. The whole idea of trying to transcend, which I take issue with anyway, but the whole idea of trying to transcend who we are into something purer than ourselves that so many religious movements are based on, is based on the idea that what we see is not really what's there. And I think cognitively that's sort of true. Like what the way we perceive is not necessarily, and actually neurologically, it's not actually what's there. It's an interpretation of what's there. And yet we have to find some way to make sense together and agree on a consensus reality, which is usually the realm of science. So yeah, that just came up for me. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks for adding that kind of religion generally as a form of conspiratorial thinking. I think there's a lot of validity to that idea. And that also kind of edges toward part of what I was trying to say, which is that no one culture or spiritual belief or nation has a monopoly on bad or misinformed or silly ideas. So, part of my interest here is also not holding too precious, like one specific form of spirituality as being like better informed or like more authentic than another, which I think is really a problematic part of a lot of the marketing that goes on in the kind of retreat psychedelic space, especially, what Adam and I see on our field work. I'm sure, Ali, what you see in, the kind of circuits of what's happening in the UK and Europe, this call to authenticity and like what's true and like it must be true because it's ancient and old. But, on one hand, it's like holding these traditions and this knowledge in this static place of like, not allowing it to be dynamic and changing and evolving. And then on the other hand, it's also might be even misrepresenting in many ways that knowledge and, the lineage from which it comes and the ideas and the epistemology from which it comes, kind of looping back to this central concept, which tends to be this very curious, open-minded, adaptive kind of, way of looking at the world.
Yeah, great. I mean, that last point I think is very interesting. I agree with you, Olivia. I mean, both of us have done extensive field work in rainforest, working in environments where lots of Western people come and engage with the local medicine systems, the local philosophies, the local ways of understanding the world, mythologies, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, there is a narrative. I mean, this is something, again, that probably is important to expand on. I mean, Ali was saying before, like that crisis of meaning. I mean, I have identified through dozens of interviews that I've done with people, that being one of the most important main factors that draw people towards the Amazon. You know, like it's not so much, I mean, sometimes it is like healing in so different ways, like I want to heal so-and-so, but oftentimes it's like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing with my life. I don't know who I am. There is like a complete crisis of like not knowing our place in the universe, our society, and our cultures, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, coming back to that interaction with local systems and local epistemologies, what we do see a lot of the time is that we want to get closer to another form of understanding the world, another form of understanding reality, precisely because of that disenchantment of Western society, Western culture, that disenchantment that leads us to, like these people still have a world that is alive with sentience and intelligence. They live in an environment that is teeming with intentionality and agency. And there's like this animistic draw towards that because it's appealing. You know, it's very appealing to those of us who, again, like we feel like that disenchantment and that contraction of living in a purely materialistic, disenchanted universe. But oftentimes what happens, and this I think something that Olivia was also referring to, is that we're not so much engaging really with the reality of what those ontologies are, but rather that we are using indigenous worldviews as a canvas upon which we project our spiritual fantasies. And what ends up happening is that not so much we're having a dialogue with indigenous worldviews, but we're cherry picking the aspects of their worldviews that fit our own spiritual fantasies. Yeah. So now we have this whole edifice of retreats that are offering traditional treatments. And there's a great work, by the way. I'm going to write in the chat if somebody wants to look up. But there's a person called Carlos Alvarez who has done incredible work, really, in kind of deconstructing what an actual traditional ayahuasca ceremony or a traditional ayahuasca workshop is, yeah. And basically what now passes as traditional Shipibo, traditional Amazonian, traditional, that's not traditional whatsoever, but that's kind of like a new invention that is basically our Western projection of what tradition in the Amazon should be like to cater to our own spiritual fantasies. So it's kind of like a very tricky situation, really, yeah, where we want that, like we want to engage with traditional wisdom, we want to engage with a different worldview, we want to engage with that animistic enchantment, and yet, for the most part, we're unable to really see, what is there, but rather just projecting our own fantasies in it. And I mean, again, like there's many things in those local ontologies that are not very palatable. Yeah, like nobody wants to engage with sorcery and witchcraft and assault sorcery and love magic and all of the other aspects of it. They're not necessarily marketable. That you cannot really sell as a tagline of like, hey, come to the Amazon and we're gonna heal your trauma. And like even like just drawing from the medical system itself, like Amazonian medical systems are relational, drawing from that animistic worldview, right? Where illness and disease never happen in a vacuum. Like people just don't get ill. When people get ill, it is always because there's an infringement in the reciprocity relationships between human people and non-human people, right? So if I get ill, it's not because something is wrong with me, it's because I fucked up some sort of interaction with the world around me, and the plants, the river, the animals, the elements of the world created, like that disruptor created that illness or disease, and the treatment is always accordingly. It's never individualized as such, like, now I'm in my healing process and I need to heal so and so. No, it's always in relation to the environment in which that infringement happened, right? So both the etiology, the prognosis, like everything related to that process of healing and so on and so forth is always in relation to other people. And that other people can be human people, but also non-human people. And that's something that is very, very, very different than the hyper-individualistic, navel-gazing, kind of like narcissistic approach. I mean, this is not necessarily like a full-on criticism on it. I think it's very important we do talk about those things, but like there is a sort of like very hyper-individualistic approach to healing, as if my healing process, and the more that I look inside myself and heal, and the healing is kind of like tied into this awakening process, like the conspirituality narrative comes in, right? But it isn't. Like, one of the main things I think that is important to acknowledge is, if we really want to listen to indigenous people, particularly in the Amazon, and learn something about the way that they perceive the world, is precisely that very humble fact that none of us can be happy and healthy unless everybody else is happy and healthy. Yeah, that our healing process is not tied in only with our own introspection and navel gazing, but if we want to heal, yeah, we need to take into account the interactions between individual health and community health, individual health and social health, individual health and cultural health, individual health and environmental health. Yeah, and that if we're not doing something to ensure that our community is healthy and happy, that our environment is sustainable and harmonious, then there's very little that we can do in terms of like making sure that we are healthy and happy. Because again, like nobody can be healthy and happy if everybody else is not healthy and happy. And that's kind of like the core distillation of the medical wisdom of indigenous Amazonian tradition that I think flies over people's heads when we just go there with our own kind of like hyper-individualistic concern with our own kind of like psychological makeup.
I'd love to just briefly talk about this, a brilliant point, and I think I'm really glad you brought that in, because the colonialism is basically, you should be more like us, and we're going to force you to be. Saying we should be more like you is just a kind of sneaky way of doing the first thing. I think that's really simplified, but I think there is kind of that energy. And also, I'd really recommend people check out the work of Joseph Henrich, who's a Harvard evolutionary psychologist. He wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World that came out about 6 months ago. A weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And he points out just how different weird cultures are to others. And part of it is exactly what you're talking about, Adam. We are hyper-individualistic. And also, one of the key things I got from reading that book is that we do not come from societies that operate by links between kin groups. So many societies and most indigenous studies have systems that work because everyone is kind of related in some way. And so the trust system works. So this whole like fascination people have with the gift economy, great, it's nice, and I think it works in small groups, but it doesn't, our societies are not built like that. Our societies are built because we had to outsource our trust to institutions, and we also had voluntary association where we could choose who we are. I'm going to be in this guild, I'm going to be in this profession, I'm going to be in this religion. That is so core to the DNA and the grammar of our thinking that I think we can't really completely get away from it. And when we try, we get this kind of what I call indigenous narcissism. We get our own indigenous narcissism, which is, it's all about me, but I'm not going to admit it's about me. I'm going to pretend it's really about me wanting to be more like those people who are so much better than me, because they're so much closer to nature and they're so much more connected to the land, and they have a gifting economy, and we're so dirty with our money. That is a whole naughty, complex thing that I think we, as if you are indeed weird, you know, as a person listening to this, we have to, or could, acknowledge first our weirdness, our own sort of individuality, hyper-individualism, disconnection from nature as an aspect of who we are, and then work with it. But very often there's a kind of spiritual bypassing I've noticed in myself as well. There's a process of like, oh, I want to be more connected to nature. I do want to be more connected to nature, but I'm also really kind of selfish culturally, you know, so it's a really difficult thing. And I think having an open conversation about it is a much better way of doing it as a community than the kind of bypassing that often happens.
Absolutely, that's all good. So I think I'm gonna jump into the questions that people are asking. So the first one that we have by Anonymous, which asks how to create a culture of accountability relating to perpetuation of harmful false narratives and lack of indigenous reciprocity within the spiritual plant medicine wellness subculture. Okay, let me just make sure that I understand what the question is. So how to create more of a culture of accountability relating to the perpetuation of harmful and false narratives, okay? And a lack of indigenous reciprocity within the spiritual plant medicine wellness subculture. Okay, cool. Okay, great question. I think that's a very relevant question. Something that maybe we have touched on a few of those aspects just now in the last segment. The first thing I think, the first, from my experience, I think I would like to see, to create like that culture that doesn't really perpetuate the harmful false narratives. I would like to see like the apprenticeship process with plant medicines in particular to be slightly different. I think as many Westerners flock to the Amazon and they drink ayahuasca first within the confines of retreat center, and then those who like really want to deepen then start dieting and so on and so forth, and all of that is great. For example, I mean, the amount of people that I have met in the rainforest who have been for 5, 6, 7 years in the Amazon apprenticing with indigenous people and don't speak one word of Shipibo or one word of Spanish, it's staggering. Okay? I think that, like, if you really want to approach indigenous cultures in different ways, it's not only about choosing the things that we find useful or pleasant, but actually about kind of like broadening our scope of how we engage with different epistemologies, like reading literature. Again, there's a whole range of like beautiful ethnographies, like actually creating relationships with people in the rainforest that we can engage with. Are we receiving information that is beyond the curated narratives of whatever discourse is being put out there to draw us to the jungle? Yeah, there is kind of like this very flashy narrative of like, well, if you come to the retreat or if you diet, then you're going to get rid of all of your trauma and so on and so forth and so forth. The reality is very different. And the only way to really get that is to kind of like stray away from the sanctioned confines of whatever is being offered, commercial like parts of it, but also like really like reading and getting like much more depth about the actual reality of the history of these communities, the ontologies, the epistemologies. Like how many people we have met that have, again, like living in the rainforest for 5, 6, 7 years and don't even know what the rubber period was. They are not aware that 150 years ago, 90% of the indigenous population of the Amazon was slaughtered by the rubber industry. I mean, there's like a whole black box that is oftentimes thrown away because we're just attracted to the psychedelic aspect of it. Like we want to go diet, we want to drink ayahuasca, we want to get like all of this wisdom, but we often don't do the things that actually contextualize this experience within a grounded historical, cultural, epistemic, ontological context. And all of those things are incredibly important because our experiences never happen in a vacuum. There's always a narrative behind it that highly dictates what we're going to experience. And understanding that narrative is very, very important. So we're not projecting fantasies and projecting what we think those experiences are, but actually being able to contextualize those things into a grounded reality of the reality, the historical realities, the cultural realities, the medical realities of the people they're working with. These are very tricky questions. I don't think that I answered any of it, maybe just ranting about it. But I mean, yeah, these are all points that are important kind of like to be careful of, so we are engaging in a more honest way and we're not just perpetuating whether harmful or deluded or projected ideas of what these things are. I mean, when it comes to indigenous reciprocity, again, this is a very tricky thing as it is nowadays, yeah, because when we are inherently bringing in an extractive neoliberal model, then things become very difficult. I mean, I don't really have many answers to that. I have personally worked a lot with Shipibo families that own their own centers. They lead their own retreats. They bring their own people. They do pretty much all of the things that a Western entrepreneur would do, okay? But that's still embedded within the same neoliberal extractive model. So the only thing is like it changes ownership. So now instead of a person profiting from it from a Western country, there's like the indigenous people that are doing the same thing. And now that's creating like a massive rift within their own communities, because societies that were historically guided by these rules of reciprocity and equality, where people were sharing resources to some extent, now are full on, within this disparity that is brought by the neoliberal extractive model. So now we have within Shipibo communities, we have this massive issue, right, of like infighting and sorcery and black magic and envy and jealousy, because some families have become increasingly wealthy at the expense of not really being able to practice their own craft within their own communities, because they're catering exclusively to wealthy Westerners who are able to pay 100 or 1,000 or 1 million times, obviously, as more as the resources that they would be gifted reciprocally by people in their own community. So it is kind of like a very tricky subject, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts about it.
Yeah, first thing, great overview of all the all the really important issues inherent in this whole again, this circuit of like spiritual retreat centers, like epistemological nuances, and history of extractive, genocidal, and slave labor. I want to go back a little bit to what Ali brought in, which was Heinrich and Nurenzion's discussion on the weirdest people in the world, which is Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. And what they're really talking about there is how, first thing, looking specifically at research studies and how they're so skewed toward focus, like on this very specific population, because those are the accessible populations for a lot of research, which we're seeing that change a bit, and in terms of intentional outreach to again, communities and people that lie outside of this demographic. But generally, most of the knowledge that we have cultivated within the academy, within medical, psychological, scientific domains, is based off studying people from this like weird category. And another point they're making is that these people are weird in that they're actually, we are actually the extreme aberration in the globe in terms of the way we look at relationality, the way we look at community, the way we think about healing and health and connection with the planet and, again, each other. And relating that back to what you were speaking to in terms of people's complete misunderstanding, like going into these places in the jungle with indigenous and mestizo people, not understanding the history, not knowing the language, etc. This is part of that exceptionalism. So we can't just focus on this subculture of like, how do we as people in the plant medicine community change the way that we go into this use of psychedelics and this use of plant medicine and these processes of dietas. It's not like you just dip into that subculture and then dip out into like the more mainstream larger thing. Like, this is a systemic issue that we have to think about. I know it's hard, like we can't, you feel a bit powerless when you think about trying to make these changes, and this is a huge source of where conspiracy theories come from, is this sense of powerlessness and this kind of like big amorphous powerful body of people or forces that are keeping us with in this like very trajectory. But it's important to acknowledge that we can't change a subculture as we define this plant medicine community and the people going down into these retreats and interacting with people in the Amazon without taking a very good hard look at where we're coming from and why going into the Amazon is becoming almost like a replication of going to some expensive retreat in the US or another country in the global north. It's because these marketing techniques are pulling us there with the very tools that are being used within the global north to keep us engaged in other forms of like entertainment or the wellness industry, because whether people like to acknowledge it or not, ayahuasca shamanism and a lot of this plant medicine shamanism, so to speak, not really an accurate term there, is part of this multi-billion-dollar global wellness industry. And I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but I also want to go back to a point that Ali made earlier on this information complexity And this is a huge part of it, that when we get into all these marketing techniques and these, the whole business and industry of what's becoming like a globalized ayahuasca shamanic religious practice, we have this issue of info complexity. And often what we talk about in public health is a very similar concept of basically like how much information you can give to someone before they kind of go into this panic or paralyzed fear response. And this is a really tricky issue because it's often very little information and it has to be kind of, put out in very digestible bites. And I'm not a fan of incrementalism, but a lot of times these things do need to be incrementally introduced to people. And that's not part of our society. That's not part of this weird culture. It's like, give people a massive amount of information. It's almost like, Naomi Klein's idea about like the shock doctrine, except in terms of like shocking people with information and then telling them, well, we can fix it, and making that part very digestible and that part very enticing and desirable and feeling achievable. I think that's my cue to stop talking.
I don't have so much more to add to that question, as I think Adam and Olivia, you have kind of more on the ground experience in those communities. I do think it's a great question because the word accountability, I think, has become very important to many of us in this community because, especially with the patenting that's going on, especially with the rise of psychedelic capitalism, and then the other flip side of that is the accountability of people running ceremonies and ritual. And I think I've been really wrestling with this for like a year, and it's really tricky. I mean, by no means, I haven't found anyone who's really like solved it. I know the North Star Pledge has worked hard at this. It doesn't necessarily have teeth though, and it can also be weaponized. So the thing is, like, game theory is really useful, I think, in these cases. It's like, okay, how do you create a culture of accountability? I think we have to start out from the point of assuming that all of us are going to cheat at every single opportunity. And I think there's a real resistance in that because we also have a kind of humanistic insight into just how wonderful people can be, which is also true. But then we all have shadows. And so we can also be really, really awful, all of us. And I often use the example of, okay, well, let's assume that we have some kind of like ceremony ethics group, right? And it's really like robust, and people like different centers and people running ceremonies get a stamp of approval. How do you prevent someone being bribed in that group? Someone gets offered $1 million. Same with the medicalization model. How do you prevent a pharma company going to someone, hey, here's $1 million, convince everyone else on there to give us that stamp of approval? And that's exactly, the if anyone watched Seaspiracy on Netflix, that's exactly what happened with the with its stamp of approval. It happens with every stamp of approval. So you have to basically go from the point of something like the founding fathers of the United States did, which of course wasn't a perfect process, but was pretty astonishing for the time, where they kind of sat down, they were like, okay, yeah, but what if someone does this? Oh yeah, okay, well, they have to have a system of checks and balances. So that, yeah, we have to kind of maybe make some kind of very complex system of checks and balances, and then it has to be enforceable. And how do you make it enforceable? I have no idea. Through cultural pressure, perhaps. People don't go to that center anymore. Yeah, it's very tricky. So if anyone has any good ideas, I'm sure like that all of us as a community are going to have to be on that and kind of figuring out clever ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great points. I mean, one thing that I do think is important also to note, I mean, when we're talking about accountability, particularly in relation to this perpetuation of harmful false narratives, yeah, and I don't think we can assume that people have malicious intent and intend to cheat or be bad actors in that scene. I think for the most part, actually, people are benevolent, and just we do tend to get swept in delusion oftentimes, and we think that we're doing something, or that we're saying something that would be beneficial, or we're engaging in some sort of like benevolent project that turns out not to be, but not necessarily out of malicious intent, but also just because of our own self-deluded ideas of what the world needs, or what people need, or what this thing is all about. So yeah, I'm gonna move on to the next question. Maybe Ali, you can start with this one. I think this is a good one for you to answer. I mean, it's kind of straightforward one. Do you believe that the theogens show us their truth or our own truth? I've seen in a lot of circles people think that they are being shown the truth.
Good question to tackle. Yeah, I do believe there is something called the truth with a capital T. I do, and I do believe that we can have a moment by moment lived experience of that. I think that's a state of being, and we start trying to talk about it, we're no longer necessarily in that state, but we're trying to make sense of the state afterwards. And so it's kind of a tricky elvish joke, maybe, that we as human beings can have these big experiences and then we can't describe them when we come back. And as we try and make meaning the more we try and make meaning out of them, the more we try and grasp them. It's like grabbing water. If you cup water in your hands, you're like, I want this water, grasp it, disappears. That's so that's how I perceive it, at least. And our own truth, yes, definitely. I would say my own experiences veer much more, and this is conditioned by the kind of inner work that I particularly like to do. My experiences become about my own, making my ego a little bit less bad, making it a little bit more expansive, right? And so for me, a big part of that is knowing what is true for me. And there's a transformative power of truth that is deeply healing, and also, very important. Now, there's Jung talked a bit about what happens when you confuse, not necessarily the two of those, more like when you confuse yourself with an archetype, for example. If you confuse yourself you confuse your own identity. Let's say you have an image of Christ, and you confuse yourself with, oh, I am Christ, rather than I am interpreting and feeling right now the archetype of that, the Christ archetype. So that's a really tricky thing. And that happens all the time to us, that we get confused, ego self-confusion it's sometimes called. And so it's all and that's why a lot of people have argued you need a Sangha. Because we can't see our own shadows, and we can't see our own crap, and we can't see our own silly narratives. We need people around us, and that we can all point out to each other, like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, I feel like you just went through a massive breakup, and now you're talking about being celibate as a vision you had. Maybe there's something like, whatever it might be. There'll be a million different things that we can kind of tease out from each other, but it's not, I think it's not as cut and dry. So my answer would be both, I think.
There's a very good reason why Sangha is one of the jewels in the crown of Buddhism, right? Like that sense of community is imperative, really, for sense making. I mean, we face a lot of difficulties making sense of the world around us, because each one of us is kind of imbued in our own reality tunnel, and it is only through interactions and collectivity that we can actually kind of reflect to each other our blind spots and call out our shit. Like, yeah, like that doesn't make sense. Like, move on to the next thing. Olivia, maybe this one would be a good one for you. Lisa asked, what about systemic forces that create situations that make individuals more susceptible to conspiracy theories? Poverty, violence, racism. How do you see the plant community combating this?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think I might have spoken, a bit to that already, and just in terms of, these. It's funny when you read about like conspiracy theory in the literature, they talk about how these blow up at certain points in time when there was like great famine or big political unrest and a big epidemic. And I find it very Eurocentric, as if there hasn't been this ongoing massive tragedy, genocide for 500 years now. As if that's, like suddenly we're seeing this explosion of conspiracy theories. And in 2021 or 2020, 2017, 2016 to 2021. And yes, of course, we are becoming hyper aware of them. I think because these conspiracy movements again, past a certain point, we're not even going to call them conspiracies anymore. A lot of people are looking at QAnon, for example, as a religious movement. It's clearly becoming a political movement. So, the terminology changes, as it moves from kind of fringe idea to more like social normativity and like social fact. Maybe it'll become truth with a capital T. These things shift and change as society does. But I think, going back to the point that this is becoming more of a mainstream concern because, media outlets and social media, et cetera, allow for the information to be exchanged at a much faster rate. Certain media outlets allow it to be amplified at to a much greater degree, so that our attention is being taken to this as a big problem now. But if you look through the history, and off the top of my head, I don't have any specific examples, but every single, taking a US-centric perspective, because, hello from Olivia land, Northern California, every single presidential election, every single massive political election, every single war, every single, big, so to speak, national or political event has been surrounded by different conspiracy theories and rumors, et cetera. So what we're seeing now, again, I mentioned it, it's like it's being normalized, but it's also considered to be novel. And this paradox is kind of interesting because it's not novel. And yet we're also normalizing like the strange, weird parts that are a bit novel with the QAnon stuff. But again, people who look at the conspiracies that are going on with, I probably shouldn't focus in too much on QAnon because there's a lot of other great conspiracy theories to think about. A lot of the ideas that they're talking about are rather old concepts, about people of African descent in various countries, Black and brown-bodied people, Jewish people, etc. We can see them throughout the ages. And I think I don't know if I answered the question completely about what the plant medicine community can do. This is a really good question, and I don't want to sound dismissive at all, but I don't see the plant medicine community as like this cohesive community that can do something outside of like all the concentric circles of communities and also like the wider, so-called mainstream society. There's things you can do within your own social network in terms of trying to educate people, trying to have conversations with cultural humility, with epistemic humility, but it's a struggle, like looking at this both from an academic perspective and an interpersonal perspective. It's really hard to change someone's mind, despite what Michael Pollan wrote in his book. And creating this change is, on one hand, again, like what I said before, there's this incremental aspect to, feeding people bits of information that's digestible, allowing them time to reflect and breathe, which is really, really, I think the most important thing is reducing your information intake and like giving people the space and the idea even to reduce their information intake and really like sit and critically think about information. Sorry, I just totally lost my thought there of what I was saying. So yeah, basically giving people enough information that they can digest it and not trying to enforce some sort of, ideational change, because, the forcefulness doesn't work. People are just going to think what they want to think. And a lot of times it's kind of just like harm reduction work. Sorry, that wasn't a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. One thing that I do want to add to that, I think like one thing that I thought about a lot is that particularly when we're engaging with indigenous communities and indigenous cultures in the Amazon, with ontologies that are so different than the ones that we have. I think in a sense, everybody that goes to the Amazon has that responsibility to really carry themselves in a sense, as an amateur ethnographer, as an amateur anthropologist, kind of like really, really, really open-minded, yeah, and ready to engage in a dialogue, as opposed to just like a consumer of services or a consumer of expectations or a projection, okay, that we're expecting to get something out of a particular way, but actually as a, like just like as an open-ended curiosity. That is very important for those interactions to really be authentic, fruitful, and open-ended, as opposed to just being engaged in this very asymmetrical consumer commodity kind of interaction. That is what oftentimes ends up happening nowadays because of the increasing commodification of all of these things. There's a lot of really wonderful questions and comments all over. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time to go through all of them, but definitely our contacts are there in the event page. You can reach out to each of us individually if you would like to ask other questions or unpack some of the things we said, and then we can continue these conversations if anybody has more to say. I'm not sure actually what time are we ending, but I think it was.
I think we have like
1:20.
3 minutes.
7:20. Yeah, by 20. Yeah, 3 minutes, I think.
Okay, cool.
Isn't there like I remember some email saying that there's like an after talk room that we can continue if anyone wants to.
Yeah, we can try and do that in a different room, the connection room. Thank you.
There's one already. Yeah, connection room.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to move to the connection room for a little bit if anybody wants to join. Cool. Well, thank you, Ali. Thank you, Olivia. I know there's a lot to unpack in a short time, but I think, again, like we said in the beginning, I mean, this is something that hasn't really been talked about a lot, not in these environments or these circles. And I think it's a very important way to open up these conversations further, and maybe invite more people from different perspectives, from different disciplines, with different perspectives and points of view, to also chip in and kind of like further down these topics, which have become more relevant than ever. So thank you, Ali. Thank you, Olivia, for coming. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us. I think we have a lot of people in the end. Really good questions. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. I will see you later on today. I'm going to be moderating a few more panels, so whoever is sticking around later on, I will see you again.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone tuning in.